takes a lot of good homes.
So we know we need to finalize that list. But,
Okay.
so we,
I'm ready to go. Hello. Anyone else? Okay, cool. Now, this is going to be a really family reunion.
Except for I'm not fat.
Yes, but I would love it if you introduced yourself.
Oh, well, thank you, Susana. I'm Janet Riker. I'm director of the University at Albany Art Museum here in Albany. So, and I'm delighted to be here.
Welcome. Great. And, well, we are just in the process of introducing ourselves because it's a small group. And they are part of the family of the artist, which is very exciting. And then Peter Jones is the executor of the estate. Emily, his daughter, is the archivist at Woodstock. Janae is part of the staff here. And John, where's John? Oh, John.
Yeah, my husband is somewhere.
And he is the nephew of Hannah Small, and we will know who Hannah Small is. And this is my husband here. I'm Susana Leval, and great to have you all here. Thank you for coming. I know it's very beautiful outside. So the first thing I want to do, and I guess you'll have to transmit this, is to thank Sarah Paskey, the director of the Dorsky Museum in New Paltz, because she was the person to whom we brought the proposal of this exhibition, and she first did it there. I want to thank Mark Shaming, the director of this great museum, who went to the Dorsky show and said, you know what, I want it in Albany. So that's really cool. Those of us who are curators and are always dreaming of having a show, once you have a show, to send it traveling so that more than one place sees it. Welcome to all of you. I'm Susana Leval. So who was Eugene Ludins? Excuse me, I have to stop. I also want to thank Janae McHugh, who was very important in the coordination of this exhibition, and Gina Shahanian, who invited me today. And I want to acknowledge the all-important role of Peter Jones, who, beyond the executor of the estate, was Jean's beloved pupil and a student of his work, and his parents were Jean's best friends, and he really coordinated this entire exhibition. So thank you. There you are. There's Sarah Paskey. I started by thanking you for receiving this show and organizing this show at the Dorsky Museum.
Well, thank you.
So,
It was our privilege.
so who was Eugene Ludins? At one level, he was a Russian immigrant born in the Ukraine in 1904. From a middle-class background, grew and comes in 1904, fleeing a pogrom. He comes and his family settles in the Bronx. He goes to Morris High School. He plays baseball really, really, really well. And in fact, so well that his Morris High School was in a playoff with Lou Gehrig Commerce High School. So he actually was in the same game with him. Am I right about that?
the New York Times had it then, playoff game. And he saw Lou Gehrig play football, too.
So they were a very tightly knit family, and I'm really honored to have you both here from part of his family, and it proves that point. Jean began to go into the Catskills in the early 20s by going to be a counselor at Camp Jenny. And before that, I meant to mention, a tightly knit family meant 3 siblings. There were 2 men and 2 women. And the women were pretty astonishing as well. They were both artists and educators. And so they had preceded Jean in the Catskills, and so he came to Camp Jenny. Now, I've given you the family background. What happens to people professionally? You know, professionally you can describe people in a very different way sometimes than you describe them in terms of family and personal information. He was a Woodstock painter and draftsman. He had a huge range to his work: landscapes, portraits, drawings, and his landscapes that ranged from realistic to allegorical to fantastical. And we will see them here. He was a great leader of the Hudson Valley artistic community, and so much so that he was chosen as director of the WPA from 1937 and 38. He was supervisor of the WPA programs in Woodstock and later in all of Ulster County. Why did I organize this exhibition? When Pierre and I married, and we had some wonderful aunt and uncle, the Zadenbergs, Pierre's aunt and uncle, who lived in Woodstock. And we went there for a weekend, fell completely in love with the place, and by extraordinary coincidence, a house came up for sale right next to them, and we bought it. So Arthur and Tommy Zadenberg, both artists, kind of adopted us, and for the next 20 years, well, we've been in Woods, this was 40 years ago, but they left for Mexico soon thereafter. And then the next most astonishing couple adopted us, who were in their artist group, Eugene Ludins and his wife and partner, Hannah Small. And we had for 20 years one of the great friendships that one can think of. And you wonder, why is it that your friendships with sometimes other older people are almost or even better than your parents, than your relationship with your parents? And it was a combination of the fact that they were so immersed in the art world, and we both loved art, and our parents, it's just different. It's different, right? One shouldn't compare. But we had so much fun. And through them, we had a window into the astonishing generations of artists in Woodstock, which has been an artistic colony since 1905. These were couples, and in fact, Peter's parents, I never met his father, but his mother was very much a member of this generation, both of them that I am speaking of. They were a generation with kind of rock-bottom values of social conscience, of social justice, of the collective good. I remember they always used to say, Jean always used to say, oh, it never occurred to me that I would make a penny being an artist. That was not it. It was just being an artist. Collegiality, they were so collegial. To the end of every one of those generations' lives, they took care of each other. They were independent, like they had all come from a maverick sense of we'll look at the maverick, and they were fun. The most fun. They were hard drinking, hard partying, hard everything. They just had a ball. It was an extraordinary generation. And so one of the things I'd like to do as a guiding, and I hope you will jump in and ask questions, make comments, is that I thought I'd organize this about why I've thought so much about Jean's work. But then I thought, what is the nexus between one's life and the work? And how is it that artists make decisions? And I'm going to start with, okay, so he was at Morris High School, clearly a really special ball player. He loved playing ball. How does he decide to be an artist? It's such an interesting thing when you think about it, because everybody starts with a few possibilities. We're not meant to do one thing in life. And so he decides, he goes to Cornell University because his family was very intellectual and academic. He goes to Cornell it varies between like 1 week or 1 month, right?
I heard 1 week, but
We don't
it's
know.
all hearsay.
But long enough to go to a couple of football games, and he said, this is it. So he enrolls at the Art Students League. I think it is impossible to describe and here this picture is a class at the Art Students League. Sorry, I have to check my dates because I'm not good with dates. So he was at the Art Students League between 1924 and 27. And it was a great thrill when you organize a show to go look at the registration and see, you know, his signature and where he had to put his address of where he lived in New York City. The Art Students League, it's hard to underestimate the importance of this great art school. It's one of the earliest in the country, and certainly I've heard art historians say that you can't talk about a movement, an art movement that wasn't in some way or another had its genesis either in the faculty or among the students of the Art Students League. So it was a heady, fabulous time. He loved it. His teachers were Alan Tucker, Boardman Robinson, Kenneth Hayes Miller, and Walt Kuhn. And by far, in my opinion, the most influential on him was Alan Tucker. It was by the first place where men and women could study together in the same class. And Hannah, who was to be his wife, had preceded him at the Art Students League, but they did not coincide. And it was also the first, it's my understanding, the first place where you could, certainly on the East Coast, where you could study from the nude. So it was very exciting. And here we have just a sense of a wonderful kind of the bustle and activity of New York City, which Gene's life was always, it's interesting, New York City was always a reference point. So it's very, this is an earlier, Peter, you tell me what is your sense, 28?
Yeah.
When Peter found out that he had rented a big studio in 1928 in New York City. So it allowed him to do a larger work. And it's a lively, fun work, which there's an interesting and creative mixture of buildings. Some of them real, some of them imaginary, and great bustle of people on the ice. And very interesting here on the lower left, you see that couple that looks very Germanic and looks very German expressionist. It's almost like coming out of one of I didn't realize two things when I started this project. One was, to me, how, in terms of his life, how Russian Gene was. And I'd love it if you disagree, please speak up. I didn't understand that to what degree his Russian roots were very important. And the other thing, in terms of his art, and I'm not an Americanist, so I couldn't trace everything, is how much he loved the German style and expressionist movement. German expressionism had influenced him, particularly in the drawings that we will see later. Any comments up to now? I mean, all right, second big decision. So he is, right after, Gene was a completely charming individual. So he had a really wonderful relationship with his teachers. And immediately after, from between 25 and 28, when he was at the League and immediately thereafter, he participated in 4 Whitney Studio Club exhibitions. That was a huge honor for someone just out of art school. And it testifies to how highly his faculty thought of his work, because they would recommend it. You needed to be recommended. You needed an in for this exhibition. The Studio Club, by the way, was the immediate predecessor of the Whitney Museum. It closed in '28 and it then reorganized itself in what was going to be the Whitney Museum. So Gene was already was very well positioned there in New York and in the middle of huge bustles and the exhibition system then was so different. There were these shows and then there were national shows in which a complete beginner might end up right next to a really famous artist. You had to apply, but there were juries of peers, of painters, and you might end up, for instance, I think I saw in one of the Whitney Studio Club that Gene was right out of school, positioned right next to a Hopper. I think.
Grant, 1932, Whitney. Mr. and Mrs. Gormley right next to Edward Hopper's Daughters of Revolution. Reproduced
You
on the
see,
same
he knows
day.
everything, but it's so exciting when you think about it. So here he is, doing really well, and then on the day of the crash in 1929, he gets on a bus to West Hurley and moves to Woodstock, New York. Fascinating. Why do people do like things like that? Well, Woodstock had a big reputation. Oh, yes?
We do, and we've lived there 20 years and just enjoyed it from Long Island.
Woodstock is fabulous.
Oh, yay! Thank you. Thank you. He said that, well, he had been spending the 2 previous years, he spent the summers in Woodstock, and then on the 29th, he has, it's my recollection that in one of the videos that we took for this show, he said, or that had been taken earlier, he said about New York, he said, I had it and decided to move. Now, I don't know what that means. If anybody has theories about who knew him, he said, I had it. I don't know what he had, because after all, New York was pretty exciting. But he got on that bus and he said, I couldn't believe my eyes when I got to Woodstock. It was so beautiful. And of course, Woodstock, 2 major links. The Art Students League had a very close connection. Not exactly at that moment, right? When he moved in 29, there was no summer school. But at the Art Students League, they had had summer sessions in Woodstock for a long time. So people at the league knew about Woodstock. And in 1905, an extraordinary visionary kind of proto-hippie called Hervey White had started an extraordinary colony called the Maverick. And that is where Gene arrives and settles. And here, this is the Gene in 1929 who arrives in that bus. You can see he's thinking of himself as a future Van Gogh. He's a romantic, it's a Russian romantic in him. He was incredibly handsome. Not kind of pretty, but kind of very, very handsome man. And a very physically powerful, big, huge man. We remember seeing him chopping wood in his 80s. He was still chopping wood. So here's where he moves, and these 2 are delightfully typical of these this very simple cabins without electricity or running water, where the Maverick colony artists were. The head of this, the founder of the colony, Hervey White, took a sign to Gene, and he said to him, I'll build you a house. And he said, the rent is $1 a year?
150 a year if you have it.
What?
150 a year if you have it.
If you have it. So it was wonderful. I was thinking of the rent of museums in New York City. So these 2 just give you a wonderful flavor. This was his beautiful, beloved dog, Popey.
Maybe.
Oh, this was
Maybe
who?
the hound dog.
Oh my God. Sorry, Poppy's over there. So how long did he have him?
I don't remember, but Baby's the one that he built a stone doghouse for. And it was warmer in the doghouse outside than it was in the house. According to Eugene's tape.
And this was his wonderful, Mary Hall was his first serious lover, and also a dear friend of your mother's, right?
She and my mother came to Woodstock for 2 summers in 1928, 29. And then after the crash, my mother's father said, I'm not paying for any more of this stuff.
But Gene always said how exciting it was for him that these young women who had grown up with every luxury that they were just loving in America. And so one of the things that happens is that at the time, at the Maverick, and it was a while, because he arrived at the Maverick in 29, and we don't really understand exactly when he ran into the love of his life, who was Hannah Small, and John, where is John? So she was your aunt.
I'm just my aunt.
Okay. And Hannah came from a very elegant family who grew up in New York City and had grown up with very intellectual, privileged family. And they had missed each other in the Art Students League Gene and Hannah had, and we don't quite know how they could have possibly missed each other at the Maverick, because in fact Hannah had been one of the earliest residents of the Maverick with her husband, Austin Mecklin. But meet they did, and here's another one of those life things that they're on the stage. It's a performance of Scheherazade, and as Jean put it, she said that they had asked some young bucks of ours, to come and throw the girls around during a dance, and they crashed on the stage one rehearsal, and from then on that was it. And they were. It's very interesting to me that never did one always say Jean or Hannah. You always said Jean and Hannah, and for over 50 years they were, and they lived and worked. They worked at side-by-side studios that still happily remain. So I just want to tell you Jean and Hannah, they met in 32, and around 32. We don't have the exact date of that Scheherazade performance, and it's been driving us all crazy. But after that, Woodstock is a tiny place, and it's so interesting how you know who your partner is. Hannah was married, and she was married to this extraordinarily lovely man who was a member of a very good member of the artistic community there, and everybody loved him. So it was a very uncomfortable situation in a tiny place. So one of the things Jean and Hannah did was they went to Santa Fe for a year to let things cool off. Although, well, there are different theories about how big the scandal was. Because, to tell you the truth, Woodstock was a pretty loosey-goosey place in terms of... But anyway, I'm fascinated by this portrait. It's called a family portrait. It's 1934, so it's 3 years before they are married. But it's clear that the commitment had been made. And I love, if you split this, and here is Poppy, the English setter that they loved so much. And Poppy used to go across the field from Jean and Hannah's house to Peter's parents' house, bringing messages and things. So if you cut this in the half, here you have kind of, again, the stormy artist, the romantic artist with the stormy sky. And then Hannah is a very kind of elegant and a little tentative and more of an interior, thoughtful, both expression and representation. Very much more in a kind of a bouillard interior mode that's very quiet, signaling there too, not personalities, because there was nothing shy or tentative about Hannah. She was one of the strongest, most astonishing women I ever met. She was a very fine sculptor, and I hope someday we can do her justice with the show. And she was extraordinarily, like many women of artists, wives of artists at that time, always took a backseat a little bit to his career. She was spectacular, intelligent, funny, used to love to tell dirty jokes. And when she was about 90, she said to me, "You want to see how flexible I am?" And she went like this and made herself into a pretzel. then got up. I mean, she was amazing. She was so fabulous. She was very delicate. Oh yes, Pierce reminded me that this is, Hannah said this was a self-portrait.
This is Hannah's work.
This is her relief. Oh, that's correct. Thank you, because it is the only work in the show by her. And it shows one of the Woodstock wild parties that were very often in the buff. And they are in the pool, I think it was Tom Penning's pool, and Hannah did a little self-portrait there. And then Jean, who loved the beautiful frames, a lot of the frames here are by him, and that's how he made some money during the Maverick years. And he did the gilding, which is so wonderful. And I want to contrast this portrait, the family portrait, with the true story, because the true story is really, I mean, this is so formal and ideal, a perfect, kind of the beginning of a relationship. And then here you have what Jean called, the title is The True Story. And you have, first of all, turmoil, Baroque, complete, complete turmoil in the palette, in the ocean, in the clouds, in the way it's painted, just wonderful movement and turbulence, huge turbulence, emotional and painted and in every way. And here is Hannah, and he told you this, why don't you?
He didn't tell me this, but Petra told me
Petra
this.
told you.
I City Hall in New York. So this, I think, is the true story. This is, worried about marrying a woman.
Worried about
Maybe a little
getting
past
tied
what
down.
you quite past, too.
And the
He was
signs.
not celibate before he met her.
Oh no, he was very much of a ladies' man. And signs of turbulence, the boat is taking water. We have one oar, so we're going round in circles. And this, I don't think this will tell you anything much about where to go. Anyway, I also am fascinated by, who are all these men? Because here, it's a very, almost a cycle of life thing, kind of representation, very elderly, and this one looks to me like Jean, like a self-portrait. There's also, I loved playing a guessing game with everybody, and they said, well, Jean is hiding behind Hannah. And then, I don't know, there are some theories also that this person who is Austin Mecklin, who got left behind. Anyway.
One of the interesting things about it is that all those men in the boat are completely helpless. The only one who takes initiative is Hannah with the oars, but since no man is pulling the other oar, the boat is going nowhere.
And I cannot tell you that the way that Hannah and Jean were aligned in their values and in their respect for each other. It was just a beautiful relationship to watch till the day that she died in 1992. So here's, you know, I should make sure that you understand that all the time, all throughout these years, Gene is showing in New York City, he's showing in national shows, he's showing in the Whitney Biennials. So he has a very active showing life. And in 1941, he shows in a big exhibition at the Carnegie Institute. In 43, and come on over here now. In 1943, he shows this picture at a very big exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York called Romantic Painting in America. And this very interesting picture called Interlude was very much admired. And that is how I got the name of the show, because the curator at MoMA called him, designated him kind of a surrealist, and called him, actually he said, erase that. He called him a realist, but he said, but in fact he is a fantasist. Because here we have the beautiful Hudson Valley with huge signs of storm. And Gene did some very present, very interesting war pictures way before the war came. But he had joined as early as 36. He was socially very active and politically, and he had joined in 36 the First American Artists Congress against war and fascism. So it was kind of this huge threat in the air, and he painted some pictures which they look, you know, the foreground is a very interesting contrast, because here all these kind of, for reasons I can't really understand, they're all men, and they're having like a little kermesse, like a little, having fun outdoors, music. Gene always has animal companions to what's going on, and they are the most fun and strange animals you'll ever see. But he loves all these pigs congregating, and this very unusual, like a little goat here, who's in a very fragile position, as is this one, who is inside this interminable and threatening pipe, who is like, it's almost like in medieval times, the dragon that's threatening the countryside. So, Gene, there are many landscapes that show the threatening of nature by technology, by industry, but also by war and violence. And so a lot of these are already very present. Now, after you show, you know, at MoMA, and with a little bit of attention.
And don't forget, Rotten Foundation is the other one in MoMA.
Oh,
it's a little bit earlier,
I did forget.
1938, at the peak of the Depression. So, you know, with the building sinking into the plane, it almost looks like, you know, a cartoon for the masses.
Rotten Foundation.
Rotten Foundations, but they're both.
Thank you. They were both. So, and they were very noticed and praised. And so, what does he do the next year? One tiny, at home, he is, in this thing, since he is not on the front as many, as some Woodstock artists have already gone to fight the war, he enlists as a reconnaissance officer. And this is, there was an observation post in Woodstock, and here's Gene, it's a self-portrait, and we haven't identified too many of the people there, but We know that he got his, how do you say,
Certificate.
a certificate as a recognition officer. And there are pretty hilarious accounts too about night after freezing night in this reconnaissance post, and they never saw any planes, but they had a lot of fun. But what happens the next year? He enlists and goes to and gets sent to one of the fiercest sites of World War II, to Okinawa. And he becomes field director of the American Red Cross in the ambulance corps. And he's age 40. Again, one of those fascinating decisions. He's in a very interesting position and makes a decision that changed his life. In very interesting ways. I think emotionally it changed his life. And when he returns from the war, everybody, and begins painting again like a madman. Meaning, I'm sorry, that's kind of drama on my part, but his energy when he came back, and he came back it was just more monumental. His work was pared down much more to essentials, and much kind of clarified structure, and everybody noticed it. And all of a sudden, he began once again to be very active in the New York gallery scene, in the national shows scene, in the biennials, and he gets going again with his life. Let's see. And then comes one of the great and astonishing decisions, is to accept the post of visiting assistant professor at the State University of Iowa in Iowa City. And he spends the next 20 years of his life in Iowa City. So let's come over here, because I have to tell you that, as I told you, it was Peter and the great crew from this state museum who did this show. And I'm totally thrilled at how beautiful the show looks here, because I can say it because I didn't have anything to do with it. Come inside here. We inherited this wall color, and it really makes the colors sing. It's really, really interesting. So here, I'm going to give you some pointers, because there's a wonderful mixture in this gallery and the next of different periods, and I'm going to just tell you in general and then let go of the scheme. Iowa was between 48 and 69, and he was visiting professor. They were incredibly happy years for both of them. They had an interesting rhythm with the teaching. Hannah did not teach, but she was given a very good student, a section of a sculpture studio of one of the great faculty members there who taught sculpture, who was very respectful of her work as a sculptor. So she had a place to work as well. And then on weekends, they would just jump in a traveling van that they had that was set up to paint. And Peter has the last iteration of those vans. They had how many?
They started with station wagons, and then as soon as vans were made, Gene switched to a van. You could open the side door, and that was his picture window on the landscape. And people wouldn't bother him, the sun wouldn't beat down on him. So I have his '87 Dodge van with a fisherman's chair in the back. It was a cargo van, so there were just two seats in the front. And he had this little chair, and then he surrounded himself with paints and canvases, and he'd open that door. And he took trips in his 80s to Texas Gulf Coast and to Maine.
And on weekends, they would just leave and go to nearby cities. And here we have, wait, I'm sorry.
Except when Iowa had a football game. religiously attended the football games.
Their house was in walking distance of the
Right
football
across the
stadium.
road.
We
And
went
so
there.
their driveway was prized among their friends who could park there and walk to the game.
Uh-huh.
50,000 people.
And then they party. And we went to Iowa and still met some of the faculty members who remember those parties. Then religiously, well, during spring vacation, then they would very often take longer painting trips. And Hannah would stay in the motel and sculpt, and Jean would paint outdoors. And the summers religiously were in Woodstock. So they always, all those 20 years, kept in touch with. And Peter's mother always used to say, it wasn't summer until the Ludins arrived. He loved teaching. And one of the other things that I just wanted to say about Iowa is that in '51, Peggy Guggenheim gave to the University of Iowa, which had a very interesting, what was the beginnings of modernism and abstraction, a beautiful collection. And in 1951, Peggy Guggenheim gave the first gift that really sent the collection in that direction, which was an astonishing mural by Jackson Pollock. And so that was a harbinger of the future things to come. I think one of the most important things that happened during those years, and a lot of Jean's work during this time is rather dark. It's dark because you have to remember what was happening in the country, and it was the years of the strongest years of the McCarthy campaign against communism. And in fact, it was not at all abstract for Jean, because his sister, Tima, had been called to testify. She had been called before the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. And that means that she was subpoenaed and she had to go. And she not only refused to cooperate, but she gave a rousing speech for freedom, for intellectual freedom and democracy. And so, am I right that she paid with her job for that action? She was an incredibly brave and courageous person. So I want to just, if you look around here, it's so fascinating to me because in this one room you have all the modes of landscape that Jean worked in. During the McCarthy years, as I said, there were some really dark pictures. Like this is called Intruders. This is called Suspicion, and you can kind of breathe the tension but you can see how this continuation of the post-war style, which is so pared down, it's so there's nothing that's not essential in those pictures. And the people, although Jean had this very interesting kind of generalized way of describing human beings, if you look carefully, some of them look like masks. Some of them, they're no longer folksy like those early figures. They're kind of shapeless, but it's a sense of the powerless human being, a very keen sense of every man, every woman, in an interesting way. This to me is one of the scariest pictures. Then during this same time, you see very interesting pictures that are realistic. This is Aransas Pass in Texas, which Jean adored. So these are real. These were the kinds of pictures he painted on his painting trips. Then you have this type of landscape, which is much more in a fantasy world. He always has these kind of luminous, but sometimes half luminous, half threatening cities, which are.
Is that Dubuque?
I don't think it's based on anything. It looks, I mean, it's not unlike his painting in the other room of the Houston Navigation Boulevard. We love the oil refineries and when they piled up in the geometry. But this is kind of wacky, dragon.
And the question, the oil, when you do a show, you always can do several sub-shows. And the question of oil refineries is fascinating because they turn into luminous cities, but also into extremely threatening situations. And for instance, this one, which falls into, this is called Oil Riches. And Jean and Hannah both were people who were tuned into current events constantly till the ends of their lives. And this was around the time of the Suez crisis. And you have all these hooded figures that, it's always very general but it's very, well, they're allegories about current events. They're never direct, but they're always interesting and provocative and make you think about what is really going on here. There's this sense of expectation, as was, for instance, that picture back there. This was around the time of the development of the atomic bomb. It's called SUN. And, you know, here's this kind of unemployed people, this extraordinarily threatening representation. And of course, Peter also thinks that that is an interesting and veiled allusion to the beginning of abstraction in the art world. And I think it's a very interesting, good theory. And then, as he got, it wasn't about age, it was a whole other way of, of thinking, which was the beginning of these pastorals that are just like, one of the faculty members in Iowa said to me, I always teased him and I told him he was the last surviving 18th century painter. Because it's a timeless realm. The palette explodes into a completely different, beautiful, but you know, Jean's people are always kind of lumpy. They're not perfect looking. They're kind of ageless. They're timeless. They have and they're always touching. They're always human. And let's see. So I touched on all these different kinds of. This is another one of those weird political allegories that he does. High-level conference. This was 57. And so they're always drawn on events of the day.
No, I'm just saying, it looks like a tent in Wadi Rum.
Yes.
The Arabs.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I went through a whole trying to figure out how accurate the uniforms were. Well, they were as accurate as he wanted to make them, which was. And again, in this wonderful mix of works, you have again the different. This is the different modes that are in that room recur here in different ways. This was 61, the year that the first rocket was launched in space, and right when Kennedy started the space program. And I love the kind of missile turned into phallus and turned into, you know, the couples, and we have no idea whether that's a cathedral back there. I don't know. It's just, Hannah always used to say, don't you want to know what's in his mind? And anyway, Jean loved machines. I'm sorry I didn't point out in the other room, there's a wonderful one that's like a splendid Steinbergian Rube Goldberg thing. And here, you know, it's so wonderful to combine a pastoral that's with this completely spectacular and useless machine that's full of wonderful. So as he got older, Gene stopped working that big, and it's very interesting because I'm lucky to be part of a Hudson Valley, to be attending some meetings of the Hudson Valley Consortium that Sarah has just begun. And I've been thinking a lot about the Hudson Valley, and of course Gene begins to paint smaller, in part because of energy, but in part because in a small canvas he also all of a sudden begins to do these huge infinite visions of landscape. And here's, you know, these two and these two, to me, are really a kind of luminosity and an infinite kind of sense of space and sense of just a hugeness of spirit that I think comes at the end of his life. And I really do think he was saying goodbye. You know, in many, many places you see either a lonely figure or three or two, and it's the artist saying goodbye, and it's returning to the legacy of the Hudson Valley. Remember his luminism and the great vision of the Hudson River painters. So he did it in a different way, but I feel that it goes in that beautiful way. I love this. And he, as Peter mentioned, even after Hannah died in '92, he took 2 more trips to Maine. And I hope you have a chance to look at the sketchbooks and the drawings. Because to me, in the later years, we never saw him without a sketchbook in his hand. Never, never. He was always sketching, and he'd sit in front of the TV and sketch. We found a lot of fabulous sketches of, depending, you could tell what was happening in the news because of the sketchbooks. And it was just so, till the very last days, he was just so alive and so full. And this is the last self-portrait we have of him. I hope you noticed that it was something he loved to do, was to kind of touch base with himself at different points in his life. And here, you know, I don't know whether he had so many ups and downs, not ups and downs in his career, but I wanted very much, Pierre wanted to just say a little tiny bit about what happened with the onset of abstraction in Woodstock and how, you know.
Well, I remember when I was a kid and spending time at my aunt and uncle's, when I first knew Gene, there were these tempestuous debates about abstract expressionism, which was taking hold big time in New York City. And the Woodstock artists, who generally were committed to a socialist point of view, and they very passionately believed that the purpose of art was to improve society and to help the downtrodden and so forth. And they tended to regard abstract expressionism as a cop-out, making canvases that were just a pretty color or some nice looking shapes and colors. To them was losing sight of the basic purpose of art, its justification on the face of the earth. But this commitment of Woodstock to art as a social medium, as a medium of social justice, which you see so strongly in many of these pictures, was really pushed the Woodstock school and Eugene Ludins into obscurity, because abstract expressionism took over completely, and the Woodstock artists were pushed further and further into the margins, which is part of the reason this show is not in the Metropolitan Museum or the Museum of Modern Art today.
Well, Gene's last show in New York was '62, and after that he could not ever get a gallery in New York because of the primacy.
He continued to, send slides around and try to get a show, and it was not going to happen.
And what's interesting, if you start looking, the primacy is not over in some interesting ways. It's just been replaced now by extremely conceptual or abstract contemporary art. But and do you want to add a little?
Yeah, you said something very important earlier, talking about the Jewish. So it was the world, as Carl Fortes, Gene's dear friend, said. There was a time when artists looked out for each other, and the figurative painters liked the abstract painters, and vice versa, and everybody gave everybody a hand up. And then suddenly, when the money came in the 40s and 50s, the abstract expressionists said bye. And that was Carl simplifying a little bit. He was a dear friend of Guston's, who became a very
Guston is a fascinating
wonderful abstract painter, wonderful figurative painter, and then returned to figuration. Woodstock was complicated, and my father, Gene's dear friend, my father was a very fine muralist for the section of fine arts, as Carol Ann Marling wrote about him, the nascent abstractionists. My father was fascinated with abstraction, had to go and, because of his social conscience, had to reinvent himself as a history painter. And, but then after the murals stopped, he starts becoming more and more abstract in the late 40s and early 50s. And Gene would have seen all that, and it was not either or. So Gene's take, and there's a wonderful painting that Susana and I were talking about, it was in the Whitney in 1951, called Working Model. And it's another one of Gene's machines. It's like a big abstract sculpture. And then there's a crowd of people walking off in the distance, and a dog sniffing at the base. There's always a dog. That's the reality check. Or a pig,
Or a pig.
But Gene was doing that. Of course, he was teaching in a school with abstract artists and students who wanted to be abstract expressionists for 20 years.
There was not a single Woodstock artist that wasn't conflicted in that way, and they were all aware. It's just that they
muralist in the 40s becomes an abstract expressionist. Arnold Blanche becomes abstract.
Yeah.
Doris Lee gets simplified.
But what you say in the 50s, once the money gets in and the market turns, the market and Gene and all of the artists that we're talking about, they began to feel that selling in New York, because of what was happening, was like selling out. And so I cannot tell you the times at the end of Gene's life when people would come to see his work from New York, and he would misbehave terrifically. He would sabotage his own sales because there was something that they could never get over, which was that it was a false construct, that it was because it was fashionable and not real. So
he was also appalled by what he perceived as the gimmickry and insatiable search for novelty in art. His favorite bête noire was that the Whitney Museum, which has at the entrance the pit on either side of the bridge that goes in. They had some artist had filled it up with used tires, and Gene he talked about the used tires piled up outside the Whitney.
He would sit at dinner.
The most corrupt thing that...
we would sit down and he'd say, "So what about the tires in the Whitney?" And he was always but the sense was that he was always trying to understand what was going on. He wasn't rejecting it. He just, it was... Anyway.
I'm not sure I agree with that.
I think it wouldn't be hard for painters of any stripe to, look askance at the tires. That was the limit. That was beyond the limit.
So when I look at this last self-portrait, you see kind of a lifetime lived and a little bit of bitterness and a lot of self-knowledge. But I think in the end, he and Hannah always said, we've had a wonderful life. And I think he felt that he had done what Alan Tucker had said, to be oneself, to be honest with oneself, to do as one thinks, to follow one's own vision, and to develop that talent, that vision, continually all one's life is the way to learn to paint. And I do believe that he followed that, and that's why he always said, I am a painter. I'm not an artist, I'm a painter. So thank you for your It has been so wonderful, and what a great thing for us. It's a very emotional day, because this show comes down when?
The 23rd.
Okay, so,
Coming home, right?
oh, well, it's great. It's been a privilege and to work with all of you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
If you have time, I'm sorry, I kept you a very long time. If you have time, it's just that the drawings are so delightful, and they show the full range of his imagination. You know, when you start painting a painting on a canvas with colors, and this is what's the lightning of the direct line to the artist's imagination. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you.